Hi, I'm Shira Berkovitz, President and CEO of Sacred Spaces.
And I'm Danielle Pitkoff, Program Manager at Sacred Spaces. Before we show you a bit about our Aleinu Safeguarding Our Children campaign for Jewish organizations, Shira, could you jump in and give us some context to how Sacred Spaces was started?
Sure. Well, I first got into this work as a synagogue youth director, and I became interested in child protection and what was out there in the field. And really, so much of what I was seeing was coming from other faith communities. There were a few courageous leaders in the Jewish community who were talking about this, but the most systemic approaches were not happening in the Jewish community. And so I found myself out in Minnesota meeting Victor Reith, who is a global leader in child protection and specifically child protection in faith communities. He was working with Lutheran communities and others, and then I found myself partnering and co-authoring a book with Boz Trevijin of Grace, which is Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, and spending time at Liberty University. Found myself at the Thai-China border speaking to Buddhist monks. And so I fell in very deep into what does this issue of child sexual abuse look like in other religions, and how is it being handled? How are other faith communities responding and leading? And as I learned, I began to realize how similar some of the issues, the dynamics that faith communities face as it relates to child sexual abuse. And I realized this is just a human problem, but there are differences between the religions as well. And so, for example, in the Catholic Church, there's a hierarchy. And so when there's a problem in one church, or when there's a problem in the system, it becomes a systemic problem that can also be addressed systemically. In Jewish communities, we don't have that hierarchy. And so every time there was a problem, it was like it was starting all over again, like it was a new tragedy, a new crisis, and the wheel had to be reinvented in handling it, and communities would be split, and then the problem would happen again somewhere else. And so I really got to thinking about how it didn't need to be this way. And even if each individual synagogue, each individual youth serving organization operated differently in different Jewish communities, there could still be standards that are in place across the board, much the way there are fire safety standards or any other safety standard before you open an organization. Or while your organization is already running. And this doesn't have to be very controversial. It's just how we come together, and we can start to say, this is what we expect to see when we send our child to a Jewish youth serving organization. And so instead of this dividing us, what if this unified us? What if this became a proactive way of living out our values of this is what it means to be an organization that really protects our children?
And I know when I met you, Shira, and I heard about your vision for creating systemic change by creating Sacred Spaces, at the time I was supporting survivors on college campuses and advocating for Title IX policy changes at the university level. And it really spoke to me, to come back to the Jewish communities that I grew up in, but also seeing the type of institutional betrayal that existed at the university level ignited my own desire to address the compounded harm caused to individuals, not just from the instance of what they have experienced, but also when the organizations and the systems and the communities that they're part of, especially faith communities, might fail to respond supportively. So I was glad to join Shira and the Sacred Spaces mission. And at Sacred Spaces, we really do our work in three ways. We think about our work falling into prevention, response, and thought leadership. And so some organizations might contact us if they're looking to develop institutional policies. We might partner with a Jewish federation to bring a series of trainings to their whole city to train staff and volunteers and parents and leadership, and really thinking about creating shared language to mobilize a whole community forward in doing the work on preventing and responding to child maltreatment. Am I forgetting anything?
No, I think that sounds right. It was really an attempt at partnership of saying that the model here is that we know you want to protect your children, you want to safeguard them. So let's do this together, and let's start to standardize this. And it's interesting because a lot of what you're talking about, Danielle, and a lot of what we do here, in many ways, I think we take inspiration from Leviticus. The late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks talked about Leviticus and its inclusion in the biblical canon. And there are many scholars who believe that Leviticus was originally intended as a set of instructions for the priests alone, because it detailed how they were to perform their duties properly. And so you could argue it didn't need to be in the Torah, the Bible, only the priests need it. But eventually Leviticus was canonized and became the central book in the 5 books of the Torah. And it's part of a process that democratized the Jewish faith. And so it becomes the model of the idea that in Judaism, texts and rituals, they're accessible to all people. It's not just the scholars or the leaders or the clergy. There's no secret lore that's reserved for an elite few. And the people have to trust those people in the positions of power just by virtue of their position. Instead, what Leviticus is doing is laying out really transparently for everybody to see exactly what occurs in the holiest of our communal institutions, so that we, the people, know precisely what's happening. Where do our donations go? Which sacrifices are brought when? And what procedures do the priests follow? So even if we're not the priests, we still have every right to know about this. And so this transparency then ensures we know what to expect from our leaders. We know how to recognize deviance from a biblical commandment if and when it emerges, and we can then demand accountability. And so I think at Sacred Spaces, we really see this as a model for organizational health and safety as well. And that too often, and I think this is true of all faith communities, instances of child sexual abuse are handled by asking the people in the community to trust the institution, the rabbi, the priest, the pastor, and say, we have your best interest at heart, and so you should trust us. But of course, you can't combat an abuse of power by taking more power. And so really the answer is, instead of saying, trust us, your children will be safe in our organization, or trust us, we're handling this, instead we say, here are our policies, here are our procedures, here's our training. Actually, please join us in this conversation. Please do ask questions. And if you're not satisfied with the answers, help us figure them out, because we're all a part of this together. And then when we open this up for the community to talk about, we are all partners in keeping our children safe. And so that's really a lot of what we do at Sacred Spaces across the lifespan, but it's also specifically in our child safeguarding work. And maybe, Danielle, you could tell everybody about Aleinu, our Safeguarding Children campaign, and how this approach really manifests in that campaign.
Yes, I mean, that approach really resonates with how we built Aleinu, which was out of the need to standardize youth protection policies and practices across all Jewish youth serving organizations. And though we were doing that work one-on-one with organizations and really to follow the model that you just outlined for us of creating transparent and open policies, we wanted to build a virtual prevention platform that would allow organizations of any size to create some of these practices and really implement 10 best practices in child protection policies. And so our Aleinu Safeguarding Our Children program, Aleinu is a Hebrew word that means it's on us. And the whole program is a virtual dashboard that organizations work through as an online curriculum to implement some of these practices. And it's really grounded in Jewish text and tradition and the unique needs and risks of Jewish organizations and how they operate.
Hi! We have some very important questions to ask you. It's about my safety.
And mine.
And mine. So please pay close attention.
In the places you send me to spend my time.
The places you trust will keep me safe.
I'm talking about my school.
My shul. My community center. My camp.
Do you know if they have a really good child protection policy?
Do they have windows in every classroom door? Are my teachers allowed to drive me in their cars?
Or contact me on social media.
What about my camp counselors? Or my youth leaders? Will they talk to me about healthy relationships? Do they know what kind of touch is okay and what kind of touch is never okay? Does it matter if the touch is between me and a friend? Or me and an adult? Is everybody trained to identify signs of abuse?
Who can I tell if I'm being sexually abused?
Or bullied? Or neglected? Or harassed? Will they believe me? Will they follow the law and report what I've told them? Will they know when they need to bring in an expert?
I know they want to keep me safe.
But not every organization has the right tools to protect me properly.
So help them out.
Get your organization to register for the Aleinu campaign,
where they can access critical resources to help protect me. We're talking to you. Yeah, you. The grown-ups. Because it's your responsibility. Aleinu, Safeguarding Our Children. Tell your organization to sign up now. I'm counting on you to keep me safe. What are you waiting for? Go!
And even before organizations get started in this work, they begin with a getting started step that includes something that we call a cheshbon hanefesh, which translates to an accounting of the soul. And as we use this work, we call it an organizational self-reflection, to really reflect on how the organization has responded in the past to instances of child maltreatment, and start the prevention work with the foundation of self-reflection and correcting maybe any past mistakes, or seeking expert guidance to take stock of how the whole community has approached this topic in the past.
And I think that's really important, Danielle, because what we see so often is that when something happens, people want to move forward. And so they want to say like, okay, that happened, but it happened a long time ago. Look at all the policies we have in place, or look at the prevention work we're doing. And really, that's good. The prevention work is really good. And everybody, no matter what your history is, has to do this prevention work. But the prevention work can't take root, and you can't actually do the work of safeguarding children if you're not properly reflecting on what's happening. What's your history? What's your organization's track record on standing up for and supporting children? Is there an ongoing case that's currently being mishandled? Do you have a known risk right now? Because no matter how great your policies are, if you've got a known risk, you have to address that risk first. And it really doesn't allow for policies to become a fig leaf, but instead that the process of organizational soul reflection and the process of preventative work, they're really inextricably linked, and they have to be occurring simultaneously, even as we're never going to have perfection in either area. And so that I like how the cheshbon hanefesh starts, and as the prevention, we do the preventative work, and then if something does happen, there's also the work we do to help the organization respond. And maybe you could say a few words about our case consultation and the way we support an organization, whether they're in Aleinu or not, if something then does happen.
Definitely. So at Sacred Spaces, we have case consultations. So when an organization either has an instance or a suspicion or a question about anything that can range from a policy violation through up to a report of child maltreatment or harassment or abuse across the lifespan, we will guide organizational leadership on responding really holistically to that case. And of course, it's very individualized, but some of the things that we think about in our case consultation work is the safety of all the constituents, of supporting victims, of whether they might need to make reports to governmental authorities, thinking about how they might be documenting that work. Sometimes we'll go really deep into crisis communication, almost in a way that we're thinking about how this incident might have reverberations throughout the community, and how the whole community is really thinking about the response that's taking place at that organizational leadership, and really helping an organization to model ethical response and support for all people involved is a part of our case consultation work. And eventually, we would hope that this work would then lead to thinking about what community healing and restorative justice looks like as well.
And I think one of the themes that really can be found throughout both the response and the case consultations and the prevention work with Aleinu is that an institution might be doing some of these things already, right? If an institution has an instance of child sexual abuse, they're very likely to hire a communications firm. So it's not like they're not thinking about their communications. Or one of the best practices in Aleinu is screening. So before you hire somebody, screen them. Well, most institutions are conducting an interview or a reference check. So what we're really trying to do here at Sacred Spaces is to take these standards, these best practices that are out there in the field, and help the organizations in the Jewish community make them really real for our culture, our faith, and their specific organization. And so what does it mean to screen an employee or volunteer through a safeguarding child lens? So it's not just, did I conduct an interview, but what specifically would be a red flag on an interview? Are your staff trained to recognize it, the ones who are conducting these interviews? And how does that uniquely manifest with Jewish examples? And it's the same thing here on the communication. So yes, you've hired a crisis consulting firm, but have you thought through your communications? Because what we know from victim survivors is that the community response could be its own form of betrayal that compounds or could even be worse than the original trauma. And so where are your Jewish values? How are they reflected in that community response? Is it trauma informed? And do you stand by victims? And so this is really the work. This is where it gets difficult. It's very easy to say, I support children. I believe in child protection. We all do, theoretically. It's just that on the ground, what that looks like, it's complex. And sometimes there's tension between real values. And I think what's really important is that this work in the faith community come from a place where we value and cherish the important texts, traditions, and laws that exist. Instead of in any way diminishing them or seeing the laws as a hindrance, we need to just have real and direct conversation and say, okay, so how does this Jewish law intersect with safeguarding principles, and how can we bring them together so that they support one another? Because when we do this, when we have real conversation, I think that's the work ahead of us for our faith communities. And there are so many people who are leaving faith communities, including Jewish communities, because they've experienced real harm, including child sexual abuse. And I think sometimes we can fall into this trap of thinking, we want to be leaders, we want to talk about the positive, we want our Jewish community or our faith community to help inspire people for the future. But the work of naming this problem, the work of owning and accepting responsibility for past mistakes, and then inviting your community to have a very real conversation and to come together to heal for any harm that exists in the past, that is the preventative work. That is the proactive leadership. And so it's really our dream that we continue this work in partnership with communities. It's our privilege, and especially with other faith communities, because there is so much more that unites us on this issue, and so much that we have to learn from one another. So that's a little bit about us and about our work here.